Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special webcast, The Perfect Storm, COVID-19, Global Supply Chain Fragility, and the New Normal. My name is Ilaria Motelli. I'm a senior economist at the Conference Board, and I'm the moderator today. Before we jump into the content, let me share a couple of housekeeping rules. So please note, for those that are interested, that you can earn CVE credits. These are available only if you are participating live in this webcast, and if you stay online for the entire webcast. You will have to type your name and full name and address in the space provided, and click OK 3 times when you see a pop-up appearing on your screen during the program. This said, what are we going to talk about? This is a very exciting topic. I get a lot of questions around it, and I'm looking forward to ask my questions about this. So we will talk about how we got here to the issue that supply chains became all of a sudden so complex and fragile. This is something that became evident during the current COVID-19 crisis. We will talk about the economic consequences of this. We will also share some considerations on what it means to make supply chains more resilient, and we will brainstorm together on the future of globalization. I'm not going to do that on my own, of course. I have a speaker that I'm going to introduce now. She's Andrea Little-Limbago. She's the Vice President of Research and Analysis at Imperos. Andrea, nice to have you. Thank you for joining this podcast.
Great, yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here to have this fun discussion with you, and hopefully you share some interesting tips, and curious to hear about how the audience will feel on some of the polls. So excited for this hour.
Indeed, because we are not going to talk only between the two of ourselves, or at least not the whole time. We will tap into the collective intelligence of the crowd. I see we have almost 100 participants online. So thank you for joining, and don't get too distracted, because we're going to ask 3 poll questions. And we're going to discuss them together afterwards. And also, we like when webcasts are interactive, so if you have questions, if the participants have questions, please type your question in the chat at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to integrate that into the discussion. This said, let's get started. Where do we start, Andrea? This is so complex. How do we start?
Yeah, no, it is, and so we'll start off by unpacking it a little bit. I think a lot of us are very familiar with some of the food supply chain disruptions when you go to the grocery store. We're hearing about other kinds of disruptions that have been going on just across the globe, as far as access to various kinds of supplies, from toilet paper to now plexiglass. Really just seeing a lot of the fragility happen, that because of the various lockdowns and basically travel bans and closures across the globe, in addition to the labor issues from the pandemic. And so what we're really looking at is we've been seeing a lot of trends come together prior to COVID-19, and really the pandemic is a shock to the system that will be accelerating it. Some of these trends then we'll talk about these trends, will be accelerating those trends, but really leading us into a future that's very different than what we saw in the past. And so this is a quote recently from Henry Kissinger, who wrote an op-ed, basically, the pandemic will forever alter the world order. And I think that's a really important point to start off on, because we're seeing a lot of discussions about what comes next, what is this new normal, and we're seeing just a whole range of discussions on what that may look like. And so what we're hearing, sort of on the two extremes, is one, this is going to be just a blip, and this is, COVID-19 is very similar to other kinds of shocks that we've seen to the system. We've had a global crisis, a financial crisis, and almost over a decade ago. We've had some other pandemics. So perhaps we're just going to return back to the globalization that we saw before, basically a return to what we had. And that's sort of on that red door. That's sort of how one stream of thought is. It'll be back to the new normal. Life will go on just as it was before, and it'll return to the same kind of dynamics on the economic, geopolitical, social systems. And so that's what we see on the one side. Then you take that to the other extreme, and you hear about the death of globalization. And we've seen, from The Economist to Foreign Policy, some of the really big, thought-provoking cover stories out there addressing whether, is this the demise of globalization? And the reason why they're talking about that is because of some of the underlying trends that we've seen along the lines of economic nationalism and just closing down of borders. We're seeing some of the geopolitical backlash against China in response to the virus. And so really their question is, is this it? Was that the hyperglobalization was here for a while, but we, basically it hit a wall and it's going to go back and it's going to be a retraction. And a lot of times you'll hear pointing back to times of during the Great Depression, the protectionism that arose during that time that ended one wave of globalization from the 1800s and the 1900s, early 1900s. And so those are the two extremes. And for the most part, we hear a lot of people falling into tidbits of each of those, and some pushing it, sort of all the way. But really the question is, what might it really be? And so that you sort of see these straw man analogies of what it might be, but really let's talk about what, the more logical, somewhere in between, what different components are likely to prevail. And so that's what we'll be talking about. What will this new global system really start to look like?
Okay, so I'm going to stop you here and ask you not to say more, because now we can launch the first poll question, and a lot of more people join in the meantime. So we actually have a very interesting number of potential respondents here. So I'm going to ask my colleagues to launch the first poll. Oh, there it is. There it is. I would like to read it, but I'm not sure I can. 2 seconds. Andrea, if you see it on the screen, can you go ahead?
Yeah. Yep. How do you expect globalization to evolve when the global economy recovers from the COVID-19 shock? So door number 1, door number 2, some other component of it.
Do you want the red field? Do you want the blue field?
I know.
So yeah, so these are the options. I see them now. So thank you for backing me up. So a return to pre-pandemic trade flows, globalization replaced by protectionism and isolationism, more regionalism, a softer globalization with localization of supply chains. So these are the 4 possible options that we have designed. I'm going to leave a few more seconds for people to reply, although I see quite a lot of answers coming in already. And in a few seconds, we're going to comment on the results. So basically, the first 2 options are what was on your doors, the red door and the blue door, and somewhat in between the regionalism and the softer globalization. Okay, so I don't see more replies coming in, so let's discuss the results. What do you think?
Well, so on the one hand, I think that actually it's really interesting how skewed they are. I will say I wasn't expecting them to be quite as skewed as they were. I was anticipating something along these lines, but not quite that distribution. So I think that is really, really interesting. And actually I think it's really interesting how few people chose the protectionism and isolationism, because I do feel like that is actually what's been dominating a lot of the more broader media headlines from the international news and so forth. So I think it is very interesting how few are looking at that.
Yeah, that is in a way, like, okay, it's very difficult also to believe in what the media say, in the sense that they tend to make it as spectacular as possible and show as big headlines as possible. So I'm also surprised to see that not many people actually, people that are doing business with supply chains, probably many of them here probably today, they don't believe that this is going to be a likely scenario. So I think that's interesting. But at the same time, not equally likely according to the audience is the other extreme. So yeah, somewhat in between with a softer globalization. Okay, let's go back to the slides and let's see. So I thought it would be useful to ask you how basically did we get there? Just to recap, how did we get to this very complex supply chain?
Yeah, no, it's great. And when we think about globalization a lot, supply chains aren't always discussed within the globalization context. I mean, it's one of those things that, again, I think COVID-19 has made supply chains, has taken it from a very niche, almost esoteric component within large economists and international business, and now it's a mainstream media headline. And so it's really interesting even just seeing that evolution of it. But really, I think a lot of that masks the reality that global supply chains have really been evolving and been really a driving force behind a lot of the globalization. And so we'll walk through just a very brief, high-level overview of how we did get to the point where we are now, getting to a point where it is so complex, where there's so much fragility in so much concentration. And so, as globalization evolved, a lot of it was driven by the trade flows and the trade integration that was going on. Really, if you think about it, a lot of it goes back to immediately from the post-World War II era, some of the international organizations that were created. But the way I look at it also is just the role of technology and other aspects of geopolitics as well that also came together and helped shape the evolution of global supply chains and globalization. And so in the 50s and 60s, the advent of computers and containerization really changed the whole logistics system and transport. And so that really made it much easier to do more of the global trade. And so that kind of continued on for a few years, but then with the end, a few decades, I should say. And then with the end of the Cold War, though, that really was a shock to the system. So, for me, when I think about these shocks that are going on, I do think 2020 will be one of those years that we put up there with 89 and 45 as really transformational for the way that the international system works. And so with the end of the Cold War, we really started seeing a much broader shift going on to Asia. We started seeing the emergence of these global supply chains really start to take shape, as early at that time. And a lot of it was driven by the Japanese model of lean production. And so if you hear today a lot of discussions about cost optimization and just-in-time delivery and hyper efficiency as far as the trade flows go and the trade production goes, that really has its roots back to the Japanese model that really started to take off in the 80s and early 90s. And so with that model and with that shift that what was going on, in the early 2000s, yet again we started seeing some additional significant shocks. The internet obviously has transformed everything and continues with the digital revolution, but really with the start of it, it transformed the way trade could be done, the way business could be done. But I think what also gets often overlooked is the 2001 Chinese membership in the WTO Trade Organization, which really helped integrate China much more so into the global economy. And it really came at a time that there were big debates going on right around 2001 and around WTO membership that often gets overlooked. I think looking back now, it's easy to think that of course they became a member. It wasn't overly assumed that would happen at the time. There were some vigorous debates about it, and so that was really significant when that happened, and it really led to just the exponential growth of the trade and of supply chains. And then we get into the 2010s in the last decade, and while the hyper trade that had been going on for a while did ebb a little bit, it still was growing in a positive trajectory. And part of that also can be linked to again, technological innovation. And so, Internet of Things really took off. Big data analytics, I think, is really important when you're thinking about the impact of automation and what can be done for optimizing and creating greater efficiency for the supply chains. Machine learning and automation is really helping a lot of the major suppliers and even procurement across the board really figure out ways to optimize as best as possible down to the most minute detail. And so those really became entrenched and part of the system. And at that same time, China's role in the global economy really just exponentially took off. And if you look at the role of China as far as GDP per capita, or GDP and across the globe, say in 01, 02, 03, compared to now, I mean, it just increased, 5 times during that time, 5-fold. So just really significant changes that were going on. And through all that, though, there was this really big push for just having that just-in-time production, sourcing as fast as possible, leveraging the technology, and along with it became this really specialization of components across the board. And so as more and more supply chains became dependent on various kinds of specialization, they became more and more complex. And so that you'd have your suppliers, but your suppliers had suppliers, and so into the nth tier, and you may not necessarily be aware of where those dependencies were. And so all that really started to become much more complex, much more nuanced. But the focus on driving towards achieving those efficiencies, that really led to a bit of a lack of understanding and sort of complexity and really lack of visibility across where your entire supply chain was.
Which is a perfect way to start our second poll question, which is in fact about the number of suppliers, which I think gives a good idea about this issue of complexity that you just mentioned. So the question is, how many suppliers are in the global supply chain ecosystem over average global brands? Dozens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. So unlike with the previous question, where there was no good, correct, or not correct answer, here we have one. But I will wait a few more seconds to ask Andrea to tell us what it is. So of course, this issue of the supply chain complexity then opened a whole new range of issues with sustainability and responsibility over those suppliers. So there is a lot, and this complexity generated a lot of other problems that problems were not anticipated at the time. China joined WTO and this whole transformation happened. So there is an interesting evolution there also in business issues. So I see replies are more or less stable. So we have about half of people that clicked thousands, and only 2% dozen. Then we have 25% hundreds and 22% tens of thousands. So Andrea, what is the right reply here?
Yeah, so we're looking at companies with a global brand. It gets into tens of thousands, and it can even get to hundreds of thousands across their entire ecosystem. And so definitely for some of the smaller companies, you can think about have this smaller supply chain ecosystems. For the global brands, it can get up into the actual hundreds of thousands for some of them, which is just almost unfathomable to be able to track and have visibility across all of those suppliers, and which adds to the complexity of it, and it adds to the lack of visibility, and it I think really helps inform why when some major disruptions come, different companies may be caught by surprise at what actually that they were actually impacted by it, because they just don't know how far down that their supply chain goes, or even where it goes.
Okay, I think we can bring the slides back in and continue. In the meantime, I see a comment. So there was a previous comment from Jason when we were talking about where are we, and he points to the fact that it's not easy to change the direction of a ship, and I guess a lot of big ships are out there in a short time frame. So I think it's a very fair comment. I see Dean said it would be helpful to think in terms of sectors as globalization supply chains varies a lot. OECD statistics on value-added chains in advanced economies suggest that supply chains are most complex in descending order in motor vehicles, chemicals, and consumer electronics. Right.
Yeah, and I think the industry-specific focus, I think, is a really interesting and valid point. And I think, but one thing I want to not overlook, though, is what we're finding, especially look at in the healthcare industry, for instance. So while those are extraordinarily complex, we're having similar issues, just to different scaling, in many of the other industries as well, and being impacted in ways that perhaps were not, perhaps were known in some of these cases, but also the extent of which may not have been known. But I do think that's an important point. And for sure, just to highlight, globalization absolutely has not been uniform across the globe, and so that I think is also something interesting, relevant to point out. You look at some of the global trade flows and so forth, but when you're looking at it, compared to other eras, much more interconnections and interdependencies across so many more facets of the globe than really at any other time that we've seen. But absolutely, I mean, in the hour that we have, I don't think we'll have time to break into the various nuances, but I do think those are really important points to keep in the back of mind, that there will be variations based on, in international relations, you like to say, where you stand depends on where you sit. And so there are variations on where you are and what the impact is.
Returning to your slide, so can you unpack this issue of fragility? What is this caused by?
Yeah, and so we got to this point, with as as globalization continued to extend to various aspects, various corners of the world. At the same time as global trade continues to take off, as technology is really making so much of it easier, as we're getting to this optimization, really when COVID-19 comes and hits, it's just this shock that really just disrupts that fragility that was made. And the fragility, the way I look at it, has these four underlying components to it. And so the first one is the complexity. And so that gets at the point of the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different suppliers, and it gets into the notion of the specialization, and that's why there are so many of the extended supply chains going on. And we get into the focus on the cost optimization, and all the confluence of the cost optimization, the specialization, digitization, all of that coming together really just create such an extraordinarily complex web of supply chains. And that's where even I think even calling them supply chains is a little bit outdated. It kind of assumes just one link going all the way down, and it's really this vast web now of interconnections and interdependencies across supply chains. Because you're even at the point where you might have a supplier on your tier 2 that might be, you have a couple of them that might then both be dependent on the same supplier in supply 3 and tier 3, and that supplier might have different dependencies. And so it is this web that gets created with a range of dependencies across the entire system. So just extraordinarily complex, extraordinarily difficult to maintain visibility across it all. And that's where the opacity comes in, that the supply chain complexity really limited the visibility for enterprises to understand what's going on across all those tiers. Where are all those connections being made? Where are the dependencies going on? And so when there are vulnerabilities within your supply chain, you may not know. And so some other polls that have been done, in asking as far as the visibility, most companies have a pretty good idea of their tier 1. And so I think that's the first level. But very often they left anything beyond that up to their suppliers to stay on top of. And it wasn't something that they viewed as necessarily their own concern. And so that's where you had the lack of visibility. And so part of it was not a prioritization to understand how it all fit together, but also just really hard to figure out where all the different pieces fit together within your supply chain.
A comment on that. Sorry, I'm
so
sorry to interrupt you. There's a comment on that. So that's what Tim is writing. So most companies don't have visibility across all of the suppliers. It is a great challenge for focusing on tier 1 and then from there help. So that's example 1.
Yep, and that's exactly right. Understanding your first level is the first step, and so that's great. But then starting to, I think as we're going forward, the enterprises are really going to want to be able to look farther than their first tier suppliers. And I think COVID has really driven that home, because at the end of the day, this was a big disruption, continues to be, obviously. There will be future disruptions as well. And so when we get further into the talk, we'll talk a bit more about maintaining resiliency as we try and weather this storm and getting into the next one. But absolutely, there's huge challenges across the board, across the supply chain. And to add on to the lack of visibility, the complexity that's emerged, just enormous concentration risks. So lots of bottlenecks and choke points. A lot of them leading back to China, and that's where we saw very early on some of the supply chain disruptions. If you remember back in January, we saw Apple having to being disrupted in some of their supply chains when in the very early stages of the pandemic. And of course, those bottlenecks and choke points became much more apparent over the last few months. And so really those concentration risks that were out there, again, I think it was one of those things that I think enterprises and leaders knew might be a concern, but really didn't understand how significant of a concern it was, because if it's so complex and you don't have the visibility into it, you don't really know exactly where that concentration risk is and where those dependencies are. And then if that all wasn't enough, over the last few decades, we've really seen the exponential increase of cyber attacks. And so and that matters not just to the main enterprise. So many of the various modes of entry for cyber attacks is through a contractor supply chain. And so it becomes a third-party risk concern if your contractor or someone within your supply chain becomes the point of entry into your own system. And so we've seen this enormous complexity in the threat environment for cyber attacks as well. And for that, I think we think a lot about China and some of the IP theft that goes on, but it's really there's a growing list of nation-state actors, non-state actors. There just actually was news today of a private company, yet again doing a hacker for hire against some of the financial companies and investors across the globe. And so we're really seeing the basically a private sector market now for hackers for hire, in addition to some of the underground work of criminals, in addition to the nation states that are going on. And so we just see a huge broad range of cyber attacks that really are looking for the easiest point of entry. And so if your company is a big global brand and you're pretty well fortified, but your tier 2 supplier does not, that might be the way into your system. And we've seen that in the past as far as different modes of entry. So really just complex and hard. And that's one thing to highlight is that this is a really challenging problem, right? It's not it's not that everyone had their head in the sand like that, like in the picture. It's really a hard challenge to find out how to balance all these different considerations with everything moving so fast.
So as if this was not enough, then COVID came, and it created one of the biggest crises we've seen in this century. And so I put here on this slide just some random selection of countries from around the world where, and what you see there is GDP growth in Q1. This is growth compared to the previous quarter, so Q4 of 2019. And it's just to give an idea of how big the disruption is. And so we are in the range of minus 10% in China, somewhere between 5 and 6 in France, Spain, and Italy. On the other side of the chart, there is the US, where the disruption was kind of limited in Q1. It's minus 1.2%, but it will increase much further in Q2 as Q2 numbers come out. And so here it gives an idea of the disruptions that we're going through. And I've also included in the deck that, by the way, every participant can download any moment. I've included also our estimates for GDP growth from several economies in 2020 and 21. And you see also the history from 2019. So just to give a rough idea of the numbers, we're talking about a contraction in Europe and in the US in the range of minus 7% for 2020. In China and India, we're in the range of minus 3%. You might notice that our numbers for China are not the same as the official numbers. We have our own estimate of GDP growth in China. So the official is somewhere around plus 1%, but we estimate something around minus 3% this year. And a big rebound for China and India next year, somewhere in the range of 8%. So all in all, for the global economy, this is a huge hit because we estimate minus 4.8% contraction in 2020, but we also estimate a rather strong rebound next year, plus 5.5%. So it's just to give an idea, I mean, just to put things in perspective, you know, the world was growing at something between 2 and 3% before that. We haven't seen such a big recession in a long time, and actually at the global level, it is a very rare event that GDP growth goes in the negative territory. So normally, when already global growth is around 2%, it means that there is a recession in many countries in that moment. It's very rare that global economy goes into minus territory. So this is a rather unique event in the history of the global economy. So Andrea, I have to ask you the question: what does it mean for trade?
Right, and so I'll show some charts coming up, but absolutely, in global trade, it'll be taking a significant hit. And so, in part of that, the impact on the global trade is, here's just one. The Bank of England predicted, about a month ago, this will be the worst contraction for them since 1706. And so, to get back to Ilaria's point, as far as this is not normal, this is a very significant shock to the broader global economic and financial system. I mean, it really is, and I think it's difficult to overstate just how big of a shock it is and the different areas where it is having an impact across the economy. And so, we've broken it down here into a couple different areas as far as economic activity. If you look at the global economy, basically a third of the economy ground to a halt over a few weeks. And so, when doing comparisons, the Great Depression across the globe had a deeper impact, but the rapid pace of this and the depth of it together is really unprecedented. I mean, it happened so quickly that that part it's very hard to prepare for a shock of that size that fast. And so, when thinking about the GDP, in the U.S., projecting a 34% decline, we'll see what happens. You have a few more weeks to go. Global GDP projections, originally, like what Ilaria said, normally are in the positive. That's traditionally the way we see them. But they change from positive to a negative 4% across the globe, with the advanced economies having the biggest impact. And they're expecting still, even from there, this isn't a rebound that will happen immediately next year either. So this is those are 2020 expectations, and still there'll be a prolonged impact that we feel. In the United States, unemployment has been a very big, has had a very significant impact. We were at basically a record numbers of just 3.5% and jumped to 14.7%. Aware that this latest ones for May have it declining a little bit, But although even yesterday I started hearing some pushback from various economists on those metrics, and so we will see what ends up happening then. But may anticipate the actual numbers as high as 20%, exceeding 40 million here. Half of U.S. adults with a job dropped to one of the lowest percentages in history. And April was just such a significant drop in jobs. So again, going back to the depth and the speed of it is really what we need to be focusing on as far as why it's such a big impact. And part of it gets back to, again, the role of COVID. And so COVID is very different from previous pandemics that we have had. The cost of it is expected to be $4 trillion by some estimates. And what we're already seeing, it could be a recession. We're seeing some debt crises, political instability. In the emerging markets, we're starting to see capital flowing out. And I've heard some reference it as the COVID cliff. And so really just a global impact that's gone on in those areas. And if you look at the pandemic compared to previous ones, it's off the charts. It literally cannot be on the chart for this when you look at the cost range. And so, in the past, what we've generally seen for previous pandemics, have been measured perhaps in the tens of billions. And now we're looking at something, we're measuring the impact of COVID in the trillions, and potentially over $8 trillion 5-year projection. So just really unprecedented numbers across the board, and having such a negative impact on public health and obviously on the economy as well. And that's where you see that such deep disruptions going on across the globe because of such a significant shock. And we're still obviously in the middle of it, right? And so even if you look at the latest news right now, as far as areas where there's still plenty of areas across the globe where it's spiking. Brazil is becoming a spot with more spiking incidents being reported. We're seeing in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. And so we have that going on at the same time where you see in New Zealand declaring no cases. And so huge variation. That's why this is something really important to keep an eye on. And if you're thinking about for your own company, your own position, and as far as global supply chains, it will be huge variation across the globe depending on where your global footprint is. And so getting into the question about trade, and if you look at this, you can see a little bit of a blip down from the 2008 crisis. And obviously it was a significant amount, but compared to what we're seeing today, as far as the worst case scenario, they just don't compare. And really, when you look at the trade disruptions that are going on, from a March survey, almost 3/4 of U.S. companies experience some sort of supply chain disruption. And so it is across industries that this is happening, very much so. You're feeling it more in certain industries than others, but there's some level of disruption across the majority of companies. And going back to that notion of visibility, part of the respondents noted that they don't have the visibility to truly understand what's in their supply chain or how to restart it. And that's why visibility becomes so essential. It's not just for predicting and looking ahead to gain resilience against disruptions, but it's also for knowing how to restart once those disruptions actually occur. And so many don't have that ability to do that. And when thinking about China, again, this was a survey that was done in March, and so it was still very prominent as far as the impact of the lockdowns in China. Almost half didn't have a plan in place. And if you go back to that concentration risk discussion that we had, if companies have so much concentration dependencies within China, but almost half don't have a plan for how to deal with any kind of disruption, that becomes a problem. And so we're really, it's put us into a scenario where we're expecting world trade to fall between 13 and 32%. Again, all these are projections, and so that's why you're going to see some wide variety on that. But they are, the expectations that the U.S. and Asia as being among the hardest hit.
And perhaps to put things in perspective, if I remember correctly, what we saw in 2009 was a drop of 20% in global trade. So these numbers are kind of reasonable if we look at recent history, and that's another big shock. Related to what you said before, there was an interesting comment. I'm going to read it. A comment from Ruth that says, in terms of resilience, sustainability, symmetry, etc., there is an urgent need to bring more transparency into the system. And I think this is a very good transition towards our next poll, which is going to be about the new normal, and we will get to what that means. But first, I would like to launch the poll question number 3. So the question is, how do you expect the supply chain strategy of your company to evolve? We need to increase resilience, we want to become more local, we want to become more global, we need to decrease our dependency from China, no change is expected, other. And I hope those that pick other that will write a comment about that, you know what that is. So here again, I mean, I think I'm very curious to see the result of this, because it's very hard to understand what is going on, because data come out very late. I mean, data for research, I guess we have the same problem here, Andrea, on different sides of the world, that we deal with sometimes significant delays of months to get data. And so it's interesting to see what 125 participants are responding here.
And I think that's why questions like this, I think, are so important, is because it'd be great to get into just lessons learned that can be shared to help other enterprises, other leaders, help them learn what's worked in the past, what doesn't work. And so as all these organizations are preparing for the new normal, helping provide and have some collaboration to help inform what might be a nice path ahead, a more resilient
path. I don't see the numbers, actually see the numbers changing a little bit. So something like 60%, close to 60% of respondents say we need to increase resilience. And then the second 15% says we need to decrease our dependency from China. And then also we want to become more local, 8%. We want to become more global, 2 respondents, and then other 2 respondents. I'm going to ask the 2 that reply other, if you don't have problems with anonymity or something, it would be interesting to hear what's cooking in your company on supply chain strategy. So if we bring the issue of decreasing the dependence on China, of course, has a relative importance here. I don't know, Andrea, how do you see this? How does it feed into the new normal?
Yeah, I think that this seems, it seems about right. When you think about increasing resilience, even that, that can then be unpacked into, well, what do we really mean by that? And I think for the different companies, it probably means something a little bit different depending on where they've figured out some of their disruptions, what some of the sources of disruption were. But I think across the board, I was talking to someone actually the other day, and I was saying I think resilience might be the buzzword for 2020, and I think that's really what across the industries, across just even societies, like how can we become more resilient to these kind of disruptions, and how it gets into how can we plan better for it, how can we be more agile for it, what preparations can we be doing now to become more resilient, to be able to withstand these shocks. And I think in one of the notes I was only skimming through them quickly, for when that second wave comes. And that's what I think a lot of folks are looking at while they're expecting future disruptions down the road. But by from what we're learning from the medical community, there's a good chance there will be a second wave. And again, it's still very prominent across the globe. So even considering whether we're in the first wave or not, I think that's probably too premature. But come the fall and winter, when the second wave comes, companies want to be more prepared to prepare for that. And so it does get into how do we think short term that can be done, what can be done long term. And so I think this makes sense. So I guess one area we do hear a lot more about sort of the movement towards localization and onshoring than this. And so I think perhaps I was expecting that to be a little bit higher, but I think that also depends on various industries. And it also comes in, and we'll talk about some of this, the realities of comparative advantage still works quite well. And so you can't bring everything home or bring everything local, even if you may want to. And so there'll be but I do think there'll be some considerations as far as who you're deciding are your trade partners going forward. So I think this is it's very interesting to me.
I actually, there's a comment here, and if we can bring back the slides, I think we can continue because it feeds into this. Comment from James: while we will practice a more resilient strategy, lower cost, partnership, and reliability will drive the supply chain more than the location. So I was also surprised that we didn't have a lot of, only 5 people, I think, picked the location thing. Because I'm sharing this slide, which is from a report we published a year and a half ago almost. And the report was called, Going Local. And it was basically built on this strategy. This is the most important chart on the report. And it may seem a little bit outdated, but that's because we were working with input-output tables at the global level. And this gets updated really with very, very long delay. So this is as good as we could get after 2015 last year. So what we showed in this report is basically that the foreign value-added shares in total manufacturing output has been decreasing, and it has been decreasing since 2011. So there was it increased. So long wave of offshoring, as we said at the beginning of the webcast, especially peaking after China joined the WTO in 2001. So big uptick. Then strong disruptions around the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009. But then what seems to be happening is that behind the surface, something was already changing. And so the manufacturing sector, especially in advanced economies, started to source more locally, or at least started to source less globally. And so we argue that there's a lot of movement in place since then that would push companies to do that even more. And that is basically the fact that the wage gap between advanced economy and China has been declining. At the same time, productivity has not been growing as much. So lots of competitiveness in China, then sustainability concerns, so responsibility of the supply chains, but also consumers becoming more conscious and choosing the made-in, based on the made-in. And then a whole set of risks, which I think you outlined really well, everything that is related to visibility, complexity. So for these basically three sets of reasons, we argued a year and a half ago, so long before COVID, and even actually we started working on this before the trade war started. We were arguing we expect this trend to accelerate. Do you agree with that? And how does it feed now into the new normal?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, we've seen so many of these, trends were, just beneath the surface, I think, for a lot of folks. And I think because that they ran counter to the global, the hyper-globalization narrative, I think that they were often overlooked. But I think, yeah, I agree with that. I think there was a growing discussion on it. And then I think especially the trade war really started prompting many companies to start rethinking where they're going to have their locations. But I do also think some other considerations started coming into play as well when you start thinking about, especially in technology, some of the tech regulations as far as where components are coming from. And so you're starting to see all these various geopolitical considerations tying into the economic considerations as well to cause some of these shifts that were going on. And so I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And the thing is, with localization, I mean, there was a reason. There were very strong momentum for more of the global trade, and that's because it was a cost benefit for the companies involved. And so going back to localization is going to be much harder than is anticipated, which I think maps pretty well to the notion of a softer globalization with some local components. And that's it seems to be that might be the way where many companies go to start optimizing based on the new risks from that new normal. And so thinking about that, so if you think about
that's I just wanted to ask in fact, and this China option, reducing our dependencies on China. We hear a lot this question, decoupling. If you can explain what we mean, because this is not always the same for everybody.
No, it does not. And even what I say, I'm sure we'll be able to pull up 5 different definitions of it that are a little bit different. And so when I think about decoupling, at the global level, it more often than not refers to China and decreasing dependencies on China for across the various supply and the trade chains that we see. But it's increasingly extending into decoupling various kinds of dependencies, and many times it also even gets linked in together with more of a localization component to it. You're thinking that decoupling then automatically means localization, and so I personally don't think that they're two opposite ends. I think that decoupling means rethinking your concentration risk and rethinking your strategy to figure out how to still maintain resilience, but it may mean decreasing the concentration risk that you have. And more often than not, those concentration risks are eventually linked back to China in many regards. But there also is a geopolitical component to it that I think cannot be overlooked. And I think that in the past it was largely economic drivers that led to it, but I think there are geopolitical components coming into play, as well as the data protection and data components that we talked about with the insecurity. And so that's how I think about decoupling. And this map shows basically what the dependencies were And this was, I think from Bloomberg in early March to highlight the countries that were dependent on China for their supply chain to explain some of the disruptions that were happening early on. And so you see a lot of dependence going on, but the decoupling that we're talking about now and the big push to diversify your suppliers by geolocation really was already underway. And like you talked about with some of your charts. And so the years of a trade war really already started shifting the cost calculus. There have been several other polls already that have been out there on reshoring. And so it's something that is increasingly top of mind. And so it was one of those things, again, it was under the surface. Some companies had already started thinking about and following through with how they were going to be reshoring across the globe. But really, COVID it has just been accelerated from perhaps a conversation that was only in certain parts of a company to becoming a C-suite concern as well. But the reality also comes into play that it actually is very hard. When we think about supply chains, it's not as easy as because there are actual physical infrastructure components to a supply chain. It makes it very difficult to just transfer from one country to another. I mean, China has spent decades now building up the ecosystem to make it an attractive place to have feed into various supply chains across various sectors. And so that's very hard to replicate. And so you have the infrastructure, you've got the demographics in the labor force as well that obviously are also very hard to replicate. And so all those kind of cost calculations have to come into it. But really it is driven by the concentration, the lack of visibility across the ecosystem has highlighted the dependencies. And so it's really that balancing act of how can we overcome these dependencies, but also deal with some of the costs. And so that thinking local and global kind of gets at that first poll that we had as far as softer globalization, where companies will likely be thinking about how can they have some sort of multi-track global supply chain where they've got greater control over some core aspects of their supply chain. And those areas may be that they might want to focus more so on either nearshoring, something within their own region, to actually onshoring within their own sovereign domains. And so I think that diversification is really going to be popping up. Harvard Business Review had an article recently on, is India the next China? And so there's a lot of projections already going out there right now as far as predicting, where's the next one? And what we're seeing is, there are challenges. There are challenges, for what I just talked about, but also even just looking at the structures of the economy and how much of the economy is formal versus informal, and so many different factors come into play. Then even on top of that, it's the role of technology. Technology also actually is adjusting the cost calculus for what can be done, closer to the shore of a given company's headquarters. So a lot of factors coming into play as enterprises are really starting to rethink how they can overcome some of these concentration risks and dependencies. And so when thinking about what factors you may want to consider when you're thinking about creating more of an agile supply chain for having greater resiliency to some of these disruptions that are coming up, we need to be thinking broader about risks. And I've spent a fair amount of time both on the geopolitical side and on and cyber as well. And we tend to silo a lot of these risks as opposed to thinking about how they holistically may impact a supply chain. And so geopolitical risks, I think, are something that we increasingly need to be prepared for. I think discussions of a new Cold War actually oversimplify what we're going to be emerging into. I don't think that's it's not as simple as a bipolar world system. We have lots of emerging powers. We've got a lot of interesting dynamics going on. And so just paying attention to the geopolitical situation going on as power shifts across the globe, I think it's going to be really important. On the financial side, obviously, we're seeing, I mentioned earlier, the emerging markets. We're seeing just tremendous variation as far as financial risk from country to country. Operations, obviously, we were thinking about how technology is really helping continue to create more efficiencies in operations, but how those operations and logistics are going to continue is a core consideration. And then the thing about governance is becoming a more important risk factor. Everything from how you're preparing for climate change to environmental and social governance, and so all those factors can come into play. And then the cyber component, how much is your data protected? Is it both? You can think about both cyber attacks, but also there are a lot of data localization laws that now enable governments to have access to data. And so, do you want to be placing some of your IP at risk by depending on where you end up deciding to alter where you move next? And if that all, honestly, isn't enough, we look at the shocks to the system that emerge. And so COVID is one of them. The second wave, is another one that most likely will be coming down the road. But you can think about other, what the shocks of climate change? What about some of the political unrest, government changes that may occur? And so there's so many different range of shocks to the system across these areas that also should come into consideration when we're thinking about how to maintain resiliency for your supply chain.
There's a couple of comments that I think feed into what you're saying. So there is one example of disruption. This is very interesting from Roger that talked about the Sendai tsunami and how that was an occasion to deep dive into tier 1 to 3 suppliers and see and understand where the dependencies were. So adding to, it can be a very local shock, but this is a kind of disruptive situation in a very specific place. And then there is a comment, there is a question from Dean. So answer to opacity and complexity. Would blockchain be the answer, the solution to opacity and complexity? I'm curious to hear your answer to that.
Yeah, so on the one hand, I'm by no means a blockchain expert, so I won't even pretend that I am. But the one thing I do know, having been in the industry long enough, that I feel like blockchain has been proposed as a solution to everything, and almost it becomes a blockchain bingo, that it gets thrown in as a technological solution to almost any problem. And in some cases it could be the right solution, in other places it may not be the right one at all. And so I'd recommend. I think it's an interesting area to be exploring. I think absolutely, I think it will be having an impact going forward. But I would put blockchain in the same area as what are the whole range of emerging technologies and how may enterprises be able to leverage those to gain the resiliency. And so blockchain might be a good solution for some companies, in addition to leveraging automation and machine learning in smart ways with the big data analytics, to looking at even the 5G that's going on and what that's going to be doing as far as streaming and data flows as well. And so even then you get into for operations, the role of robotics, and then the role of are we going to start seeing drones delivering even more so groceries due to there's no human contact going on. And so there's so many fascinating areas where I think we'll be seeing disruption on the technology side to help address some of these shocks and provide resiliencies to them. And so I at least try to look across the broad range and see what might work best given various company situations.
Going back to your we're actually close to the last slide.
Yeah, close to finish up. So I was, and this is basically just wrapping up in that globalization is going to be transformed. What does this re-globalization look like? And so that we really are seeing these big challenges or big changes coming up. And so be more forward-leaning, think about what some of those changes are, and then how to prepare resilience for them. And because COVID-19 really has, it's going to be a different world going forward. Obviously, many of the same characteristics are coming in, but it's just the restructuring of so much of it, and the prioritization is starting to change. And gaining that visibility really will help companies. And again, it's hard, but that's where you're going to leverage some of the technology, partnerships, collaboration, lots of ways to get at building that visibility and greater resiliency. With really the overarching goal to keep in mind is that COVID-19 has a global reach. It continues to have a global reach, and will still have a global reach most likely when we get into the second wave. Global supply chains still are fragile, right? And so at the end of the day, we saw the disruptions. We're seeing some industries able to bounce back, but really, we really start thinking about near-term and then longer-term ways to build resilience against the next shifts, and really start preparing for whatever that new normal is. And that's why I like the example of the tsunami, because it is. I mean, we're seeing significant changes in weather patterns that may be somewhat localized, but they do end up having more of a global impact based on the complexity and the interdependencies that we're seeing within the supply chains.
So if a butterfly, how was it, the butterfly effect? If a butterfly shakes the wings in China, then a tsunami is generated somewhere else.
That's right. Yeah, exactly, the butterfly effect. And so one thing, at least for me, to keep in mind, so globalization and whatever comes next, whatever the shape and structure of that depends on decisions that are being made right now. And so when thinking about where to reshore, doing nearshoring, who your partners are, all those kind of things, globalization will continue along the lines, multilateralism will continue, but what it looks like and how we shape it and what norms and governance values that we have that's what will determine the shape of it and the structure of it. And so, I often hear sort of the two extremes of a techno dystopia and a techno utopia coming ahead. It's on all of us to help try and guide it towards the more of the utopian vision of what a better world could be after this shock.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I think this is a great way to end our conversation, which has been unbelievably interesting. I think one important lesson for me is that really there are two things that will shape the way this happens, and I agree that we should talk again in a year to see what happens. And probably the two factors that are shaping this is on the one hand the technology that we have, and I think the comment on the blockchain is very relevant in that sense. And on the other hand, what is a multilateral framework or whatever, geopolitical dimension that shapes the rules in the world. And there were a couple of good comments on this, but I don't have much time left to read them. But if you want to take a look there. So, Andrea, thank you again. Thank you also to this very engaged participants that we had today. A lot of interesting things. I hope you took a screenshot from the poll. And the good comments we got in the chat box. If you are interested in more webcasts, we have a very rich program that we managed to put together, even though we're all working from home right now. So I won't read what's in the pipeline, but we cover a broad range of topics from economics, sustainability, human capital, governance. So click on the link there, and you will go to our list of upcoming webcasts of things you can actually watch on demand from the last days. We have a page dedicated to the COVID-19 outbreak, so ccb.org/COVID-19. It's a page that we update nearly daily with new data that are coming out. So if you're interested in new pieces of research, content related to COVID-19, you will find a lot of interesting stuff in there that is coming out from our research team. And if you are a fan of podcasts as I am, you can check our indications channel. I actually recorded a podcast the other day on Japan and what we can learn. The Risk of Japanization. It's a new book that's just, it's not a new book, it's an old book that is having a second life right now because it's about what the world can learn from the lost decades in Japan. So go and check our podcast videos on Apple, Google, whatever program you use. And if you are interested in sponsoring a program like the one we have today, reach out to our team at sponsorship@conferenceboard.org. So again, thanks Andrea, thanks to the audience, thanks to the colleagues that helped putting this program together, and I hope we will talk again about this because there's so much happening that we won't be short of facts and data and insights in some months. Have a good evening if you're on my side of the world, or if you're on the other side of the world, have a good afternoon. Ciao.